At the end of the parasha, we're going to learn something that most people don't know much about. And because it's so obscure, you don't expect that it's going to have any major lessons for our lives. But that's the beauty of Torah, is that sometimes the things that people don't pay any attention to actually have some of the most profound lessons. Now, the reason that this is obscure for most of us is because it's a law that doesn't have a practical application in today's world. Mostly doesn't have a practical application. The only time that it has a vague practical application is at the beginning of the Seder. Now, you thought we were over. You thought Pesach is done. You could already have your chometz breakfast. Why now are we talking about the Pesach Seder? So at the beginning of the Pesach Seder, one of the early things that you do is you have to wash your hands before karpas, before you dip the vegetable into salt water. And the truth is, in today's world, it's not something that we commonly do. But in the old days, before you ate a wet fruit or vegetable, you had to wash your hands because of impurity. And so that's something that is spoken about at the end of this week's parasha, which is, how does produce become susceptible to impurity? In the time of the Beis HaMikdash, impurity was a very big part of people's lives. You always had to know your status, and as a result, you had to know the status of the food that you ate or the items that you worked with, etc. So, what's the link over here, or what's the particular detail that we're going to be learning? It goes as follows. Now, there are 3 laws that are associated with how produce becomes impure. Law number 1. In order for something to be susceptible to impurity, in other words, something that grows naturally, that's produce, right? We're talking about things that grow naturally. Fruit, vegetables, grains. In order for something to be susceptible to impurity, rule number 1 is it has to be something which is typically eaten by humans. So the grass in your garden, as an example, would not be susceptible to impurity because it's not human food. Even a little bit more controversial maybe is barley, which the Gemara considers to be an animal fodder, not human food, even though today people eat barley in various forms. But halachically, barley is debatable, right?
Barley is whiskey.
Oh, there we go. But that's not its natural grain state, right? And it's we'll see in a moment, it's got other issues. But the point is that rule number 1, in order for produce to be susceptible to impurity, it has to be something which is typically eaten by humans. Rule number 2. Before produce could be susceptible to impurity, it has to first have been exposed to liquid. So here's the classic example that the Gemara talks about. Person harvests wheat, they put it then into a bundle, and they store it on their roof. It was very common in those days. They wanted to dry it out so that they could then crush it down into flour. So you store it on your roof. The next morning you wake up, you go outside, and what's on your barley? Dew. So dew is one of the 7 types of liquid that could render something susceptible to impurity. That means after that moment, because it's been exposed to dew or rain or 5 other types of liquids, right? Oil, milk, honey, blood. So if it's been exposed to one of these liquids, then thereafter, if it comes into contact with something which is impure, it becomes impure. Okay? So coming into contact could mean a human being that's impure. It could be various types of creatures that are impure. But the second rule is that in order for a food that has grown naturally to now become susceptible to impurity, it had to have been in contact with liquid. Rule number 3, very important rule. And it's interesting that when the Rambam goes through the laws of impurity, he keeps rule number 3 in a separate section to the first 2 rules, which is interesting. Rule number 3 is that, and the moment you hear this, you'll realize how practical this is. As long as something is still growing, it can never become impure. Because if it could, no produce would ever be pure. It's out in the fields. It's exposed to liquid, typically rain and dew. And who knows what's going through the field? There are certain creatures that are natural in certain environments, but are considered impure creatures. So if something, while it was still growing, would be susceptible to impurity, that's it. We'd never be able to have such a thing as produce that is pure. So that's quite a relief to know that as long as it's growing. But that's not what we're going to focus on. Instead, the question is, at what point is something still considered to be growing? Let's say something was half ripped out of the ground. Is it now considered to be harvested and therefore susceptible to impurity? Or is it considered to be growing and therefore immune to impurity? So the Rambam says this: as long as there is one strand of a root that is still in the ground, and that strand of a root is enough to draw nutrition into the plant is still considered to be growing.
But it's got to be in the ground.
It's got to be in the ground. Because we're not going to get into hydroponics.
No,
right?
no. If you pull the carrot out the ground, it's now not growing.
That's not growing. Correct. Okay, but it's got to have some little, he uses the expression shoresh katan. It's got to have some small little root that is still plugged in and that is still providing nutrition to this plant. Then the plant remains immune to impurity. Okay, so let's review. Rule number 1 is it's got to be food for humans. Rule number 2 is it has to have been exposed to liquid and then exposed to impurity. Rule number 3, even if it has one little root that is still allowing it to grow, it is immune to impurity. Like anything else in the Torah, even if the rules don't apply today, the lessons have to apply today. So the question we have to work out is, what's the lesson from the story of impurity? Because, needless to say, while there is the law of impurity, which does not apply in its full extent without a Beis HaMikdash, there is the principle of impurity that obviously still applies today. So what is impurity? Okay, it's easy to say, right? Impurity is something which is negative. Impurity is something which is unhealthy. Impurity is something which interferes with spirituality. Those things are all valid. But the most important thing to know about impurity is that impurity represents or is a spiritual parasitic energy. That's what you have to know. The nature of impurity is that it's a parasite. How does a parasite live?
On something.
It needs a host. A parasite cannot live independently. So the only way a parasite can exist is it must leech off a host. It's exactly the same when it comes to unhealthy spiritual energy. Unhealthy spiritual energy cannot survive on its own. It has to draw nutrients from healthy spiritual energy. Exactly like a parasite. So that's your first insight into how impurity works, or specifically how the tumah that we're describing over here, which is the negative spiritual toxic energy, works. The host, what was the first law that we learnt? Has to be human food. Human food. In other words, the host has to be a mensch. In other words, what does that mean? You know, if you drive in a very poor area, anywhere on this continent, and you're driving a nice shiny car, you must anticipate that you're going to have a lot of people approach you and ask you for money. But if you in some jalopy that's falling apart, you'll have fewer people come looking for money. It's like when you hear of somebody in the community who's just done a good deal and, you know, they've done really well. What's one of the first things that they say? I need to change my number. Because suddenly all the relatives appear out of the woodwork and everybody with their causes. Because if there is an abundance of capacity, then you're going to have more exposure to leeches. That's how it works. So in spiritual terms, and this is the irony of impurity, in spiritual terms, you know who is most susceptible to the parasite of impurity? Somebody who has a lot of holiness. If somebody is very dry in their spirituality, Well, what's the value? What's the benefit for the parasite? You can't live off something that's barely alive itself. So that's why the first law is that impurity is attracted to human food. Humans are generally called Adam. And in Hasidus, we always identify that Adam represents not just a human, but the most developed version of a human. Because the other words that you could use, Ish, Gever, Enosh, they all represent various stages of human evolution. But Adam is the most spiritually developed person. So Michael Adam, the food of a human, that's what attracts impurity. That's a big red warning label for people when you are progressed in your Judaism, when you are learned, when you are spiritual. That does not create immunity against impurity. To the contrary, it creates susceptibility to impurity. Now, nobody sees that coming. Nobody thinks about that. Everybody imagines, I'm so frum, I'm so spiritual, I'm so learned, I'm so protected. So the first rule of impurity is the exact opposite is true. It's specifically the person who is advanced, who has a target on their back. That's why the Gemara, for example, tells us in Brachos that a Torah scholar is not permitted to walk alone at night. That's what it says. Not permitted to walk alone at night. And then the Gemara justifies the reason is because a Torah scholar is susceptible to mazikin. Now, mazikin is a whole topic in Judaism that usually gets a lot of people very intrigued, and it's great for campfires late at night or whispered conversations of teenagers when they have sleepovers, because mazikin are basically demons. So the sages are the ones who are apparently susceptible to demons. That's what the Gemara is saying. The rest of us don't have this issue. We could walk at night. We might have to worry about muggers, but we don't have to worry about demons. Why? Because a demon takes one look at us and says, there's nothing to take. There's no reason to leech. A demon is effectively a spiritual impurity. So it's dafka, the person who has this whole radiance of holiness, that's who attracts the demon. That's who attracts the spiritual impurity, because they want to leech and be energized by the person. So that is a major warning label that the Torah gives us, that the first rule of impurity is impurity requires somebody who is Adam. It requires somebody who's spiritually advanced. Exactly the opposite of what we would have thought. But then it goes one step further. In order to be susceptible to impurity, it's not just that the food is suitable for humans. There's another step. The food has to first have been in contact with liquid. Now, the most common liquid, even though there are 7 liquids that the Torah identifies that could make something susceptible to impurity, the most common is not whiskey. Even though whiskey is produce that's become moist. Right? But the most common is water. What is the most basic property of water?
It's wet.
Yeah, thank you. As are all the other 6 liquids. They're all wet, yes? But what's the most basic property of water?
Gives life.
It gives life. That's what water does. So wherever you have sufficient water, you have a lush environment. In a lush environment, anything can grow. Water is not discerning. Water doesn't determine whether or not you deserve to grow. If it's a lush environment, if it's a wet environment, anything will grow, including all the parasites. Which then fits perfectly with what we're discussing. So let's think in spiritual terms. If we're saying that in spiritual terms, human food represents somebody who is spiritually advanced, then let's think, what does water represent in spiritual terms? If you've got somebody who is spiritually advanced, and now not only are they spiritually advanced, but they also have liquid, what do you think that means? Sustaining what or who or how?
Your spirituality.
Sustaining your spirituality. Is that what water does? Does water keep you alive?
No, your body.
No,
Water
certainly keeps you alive.
Water keeps
Your body.
everything alive, not just you. So that's for example, you've got the dripping tap outside in your garden. What's going to grow around the dripping tap?
Moss.
All the rubbish, right? The weeds, the moss. That's what's going to grow because there is water. So water represents in spiritual terms not only somebody who has advanced in their spirituality, but somebody who is engaged with helping others advance in their spirituality. Somebody who is giving, in the same way as water gives life. Water irrigates. Water allows things to grow. So the second rule of impurity says, not only should you be vigilant if you're spiritually advanced, because somebody who's spiritually advanced is susceptible to impurity, because that's attractive to the energy of impurity, because we want to get to a place that has a lot of power and a lot of life and a lot of energy. But can you imagine then if that person has a lot of power and life and energy is a giver? Imagine if that's somebody who's out there, who's teaching, who's sharing, who's inspiring. That makes it even more attractive to the impurities. Let's get into that environment because this guy's giving. So in other words, when the person makes their big business deal and now they start getting these phone calls from random strangers or from estranged relatives, can you imagine if those estranged relatives hear that now that this person's made a lot of money, they're giving a lot of charity? Well, then the list is going to quadruple. Because look at that. This is a water source. We could all live off this. It's amazing. So in exactly the same way, once a person engages in spiritual activity, that is outreach, that is outward focused, that is giving, that is sharing, that is nurturing, everybody wants in. Everybody wants a piece of the action. So the world of impurity is far more interested in the person who's the giver. At this point, anybody who's a little spiritually sensitive should be getting a little bit nervous. Because effectively what this is telling us is, the more we grow, the more we're willing to give, the more we're engaged in our spiritual journey, the higher risk we are. There's an incentive to step back and say, hey, let somebody else do this. Let somebody else come to shul in the morning. Let somebody else be the person who's helping a fellow Jew. Let somebody else be the one who's learning.
But what if he's still growing?
Very good. So now you understand why, you already got it. Now you understand why the Rambam puts those two laws in one section. Because that's the section about appreciating the risk, understanding the danger that you face. Then there's another section, how do you protect yourself? Because the same Torah that warns us about what none of us would have expected, which is the more spirituality I have in my life, the more possibility of attracting negative things, then the next thing I have to know is, how do I vaccinate myself against this impurity? So what do I need? So again, the law says, shoresh katan. I need a little root. That's the direct translation. I need a little root. What does that mean, a little root? Number one, the nature of a root is that it grounds you in the source from where you came. So if you're talking about a plant that's growing out of the ground, when it was put into the ground, it was just a little seed. It didn't have all this big fancy development that is so interesting or attractive to the forces of impurity. It was just a little seed. And now it's grown into this ganze knacke, Once upon a time it was an acorn, now it's an oak tree. So now the person thinks, look at me. I'm a big deal. People should give me respect. They should listen to what I have to say, etc., etc. So you have to remember the root that you came from. It's a little bit of mud. That's where you came from. But more importantly, it's not just that we come from mud. Much more importantly, our root is our neshama. The only reason that a person can grow spiritually is because they've activated their neshama. And what is my neshama? My neshama is a plug-in to God. Like the Alter Rebbe says in the second chapter of Tanya, that the definition of a neshama is a piece of Hashem. That's what a neshama is. So what's my root? My root is Hashem. This spiritual path that I'm on is not my spiritual path to grow me, to give me an experience, or to give me a position in society. This spiritual path that I'm on is all about Hashem. What does Hashem want? So as long as I keep that shoresh katan, it's like a dual message over here. It could be a very small level of attachment to my source, or it could be a level of attachment to my source that keeps me small, that reminds me I'm not a big deal, despite all my growth, and despite all my learning, and despite all my spirituality. At the end of the day, it's not about me. It's about the root that I come from and the root that I represent. Very often we use the expression pinteliyid. A pinteliyid means the spark of Jew within me, the little piece of who I truly am, which is connected to Hashem. As long as a person lives their spirituality, lives their Judaism with an acute awareness of the fact that this is not my achievement, my growth, my greatness, but instead with an awareness of this is how I connect to my root, which is my neshama, which is a gift from Hashem, which carries responsibility to do what Hashem wants. My life is not about my achievements. My life is about my dedication. My life is not about my growth. My life is about my connection. As long as you have that, even if it's just a little awareness of my connection to and responsibility to Hashem, then I can be immune to any impurity that exists. So the bottom line message is, as long as a person is growing as an I, they're a high risk case. The moment a person is growing as a dedication to Hashem with an acute awareness of Hashem, they are protected. So that's what we have to be conscious of at all times. Keep that root, keep that connection, keep that sense of who we are here to serve and what we are here to do and where our power comes from, and then we'll be okay.